Thank you for tuning in to CanGeoEducation's online tutorial for Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. This video has kindly been sponsored by Husky. To access our Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, you can find it at cangeoeducation.ca under our Resources tab, Indigenous Resources, and our online version of Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. There's a wide variety of information available to you online. However, if you're interested in purchasing these, you can find it at amazon.ca or chapters.indigo.ca. Now, there are 4 volumes. There's Truth and Reconciliation, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Today, we're going to focus on residential schools. As I walk you through some of the lesson plans CanGeoEducation has created, I'd like you to please consider the following questions. What are residential schools? What were some of the experiences of children at these schools? And what were some of the effects of these schools on Indigenous peoples in Canada? To begin, I'm going to highlight a chapter in the First Nations volume labeled Residential Schools. Now, this was written by Anne Spice, and she describes her grandfather's experience at Carcross Residential School in the Yukon, where he attended it for 4 years between the years of 1936 and 1940. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's archives brought up records stating the school had a bad reputation for poor health, harsh discipline, and poor food. Anne speaks to this confronting data and describes the emotions of knowing her grandfather lived through this. Now, this is a great way to introduce some of the questions that I've highlighted, especially what were some of the experiences of children at these schools. Anne speaks to this and speaks to her grandfather's experience. I'd like to guide you back to our CanGeoEducation website and highlight our Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada Teacher's Guide. So this includes lesson plans and activities that teachers, guardians, parents can use to examine the chapters of the Atlas in more detail. CanGeoEducation has created mini lesson plans to help you use the Atlas in more detail. So an example of some of the questions you might find here are: what is meant by assimilation, and why have residential schools been considered a form of aggressive assimilation? And an activity idea is to consider the spatial distribution of residential schools. So there's a map in the Atlas where students can see where residential schools existed, as well as I will walk you through a Google Earth story on residential schools where you can see where these were distributed throughout Canada. Now, a little background history here. Residential schools operated in Canada for more than 160 years, with upwards of 150,000 children passing through. These children were removed from their families from the church and hoped to assimilate them and rip them from their cultural roots. So hopefully this resource will help you better understand residential schools and the huge historical significance that it has on Canadian history. We're back on our CanGeoEducation website. I'd like to bring your attention now to our Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada Giant Floor Map tab. Here you'll find a section on residential schools, and as I bring this up, you will see a warning. It says, please review the following activity and accommodate accordingly, as this activity deals with sensitive topics. So it's important to be mindful of students' emotions as we do discuss residential schools. In this section, you'll find learning outcomes that correlate nicely with our curriculum expectations, as well as you'll find foundational knowledge and perspectives for different Indigenous groups. So there's a section for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Here you'll also find modifiable lesson plan ideas for elementary, intermediate, and secondary school levels. An example of this, which I find is great for all age groups, is in the elementary school section, where it asks you to consider parts of your life that make you who you are. So I'd like to give you a moment now to think about the language, family, friends, hobbies, and how this makes you who you are. I want you to consider how you would feel if these aspects were taken away. For younger audience members, I want you to think about traditions and family celebrations you would miss if you were unable to be with your family. Think about the many things you have learned from family members and how that would change if you could not spend time with them. Think about how the presence of children and teens dictate how time is spent as a family and how their absence would affect traditions as well as everyday life. The goal here is to help develop empathy in our students and discuss how Indigenous students might have felt. The next topic I'd like to walk you through are our Google Earth Voyager stories, so Canada's residential schools. It's important that non-Indigenous Canadians learn about the residential school systems. There are 139 residential schools acknowledged in the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement. There are, however, more and many different types that have yet to be acknowledged. CanGeoEducation has data and information for those that were included in the Act, so our activities reflect these schools. Now, this Google Earth story was created by Canadian Geographic as an interactive learning tool to further explore the reasons for and the legacy of the residential school system. We've created 4 different sections: background and history, inside a residential school, effects of the system, and moving forward. Today we will have a specific look at inside a residential school. This interactive tool will show you inside different residential schools that existed in Canada, all the while labeling the different residential schools that have been acknowledged in the agreement. A few questions that you might ask students while using this resource include: why were Indigenous youth sent to residential schools? Describe the distribution of residential schools in Canada and why you think they were located where they were. What were some of the losses Indigenous communities suffered as a result of these schools? How can the story of the residential school system enlighten us on Indigenous resilience and strength? How can learning about the effects of residential schools help us on our journey towards reconciliation? Please consider these questions as I walk you through this resource. The Google Earth story starts at Blue Quill's Indian Residential School. There's a little blurb on the right-hand side that talks about child labor and how boys and girls were sectioned off and their vocational learning only occupied half of their days, while the other half of the day was spent doing chores. It also talks about the first day of school. We've got haircuts, how many survivors, their first memories have been their haircuts they received upon arrival. They describe this as a violating experience because their hair had spiritual, cultural, and familiar significance. We have reduced by a number, as students no longer had a name, just identified as a number. You can ask students also to have a look at the map themselves. So consider the topography, the landscape. Are they in an urban area, in a rural area? You can't really see a community near here, so that would have a huge significance on family and visitations. Voiceless, so students were forbidden to use their own language, forced to speak English or French. Suppressing a culture, so as these residential schools were run by the church, children were forced to engage in a Christian belief. So you can use this map as an interactive tool. This appears to be a more urban area. Students can zoom in, zoom out, and explore this landscape. And the next section here is enduring trauma. Again, ask students to play around with this map and see what other information they can generate. Now I will zoom out and you will have a better look of the distribution of the residential schools in Canada. So I did ask you to consider this distribution. Is there more in the east or the west? Are there a number of schools in the north? Consider this distribution and why it is the way it is. You can also scroll over the tabs and find the names of these residential schools. I'd like to thank you for tuning in to this tutorial. I hope you have a better understanding of Canada's residential school system and have been inspired to continue your learning. Thank you.